Broadway can't figure out if they view photographers as vendors or collaborators. I personally am in a spot that's like, great, I'll answer that question for you. I'm a collaborator. We're backstage, midtown basement that is 100 years old and like so dusty. Like,
Yeah.
where is the glamour? Because it's not here.
It's not standing next to a dumpster at the stage door. Hello, good morning. Welcome back to Legroom. Today, our guest is a photographer and photojournalist specializing in editorial, theater, and lifestyle. Marc J. Franklin has been a photo editor for NBC News and MSNBC Digital, principal photographer for Playbill, and you have seen his amazing photography in Vogue, Vanity Fair, The New York Times, NBC News. You've seen his production photography for Broadway shows in productions such as A Strange Loop, Hell's Kitchen, Top Dog Underdog, and Fat Ham. And you've even seen his work outside of the Majestic Theatre with Audra McDonald. Please welcome to the show, my friend and yours, Marc J. Franklin. Welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Hi. That was such a nice intro, but like, it's like weird hearing your bio read back at you, or like, I don't know. Yeah, hi is what I'm trying to say.
Well, let's touch on that because I've known you for a long time and even longer than a lot of that work has existed. So what have been the highlights of that kind of spewing out over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, yeah, we've known each other for a while. I feel like I remember when you were at Second Stage, and that was
Yeah.
like a long time ago, pre-pandemic.
Hmm.
And so like in the time, we've both like come a long way since then.
Yes.
And I think like some of the highlights of it, I think just hearing all of that back, the thing that stands out to me the most is like just output. Like
Mm.
we've been working really hard, and like both you and I, and also like making stuff that we're really proud of. Like the fact that like you mentioned the Audra GYPSY key art that's outside of the Majestic, that is still wild to me. Like I That's the first new show to go into the Majestic since The Phantom of the Opera in 1988. And like to have the artwork be mine is crazy. And like that show also like checked off a milestone that I didn't even know was a milestone, which was my photography was on the side of a bus. It is on the side of a bus. I
Yeah.
saw it the other day. That's crazy to me. So that's like kind of like the highlight. So much of just making art and making photography and just being prolific.
Yeah. Well, I want to dive into all of that and what goes into making it art. Let's start. So, I know you from the direct intersection of theater and photography. Is there a love of one that came first in your life?
Ooh, that's no. I they're kind of they intersect. The way, bear with me, I was like not great at science. But I feel like they're like DNA strands where
Okay.
like you got the two sides and they make up the whole, but then they like twist around
Mm-hmm.
each other. Um, and I feel like photography and theater are very much those two central pillars for me. The performing arts and then the studio art. And like just growing up, I was always interested in like studio photography, um, and not studio photography, rather studio art. And I like wanted to be a cartoonist. I love painting. I love drawing. Um, I always had my camera with me, one of those like little point and shoots,
Mm-hmm.
in the early 2000s. And then in theater, I found in middle school, high school age, and really found a community and a joy of like collaborative making. And so yeah, they kind of all intersect. So I can't pick one.
No,
I love both.
I love that, and I think that will be relevant for a lot of people that are interested in many things that are a form of artistic expression and can't like fit it into one box.
Yeah, and I think I can't fit it into one box, but I do think for me now, like I did like my love of theater, um persists and remains. And but I think in terms of like how I define myself as a photographer first. I think like there are people who are theater photographers, and then I consider myself a photographer on the theater beat.
Mhm.
Like, and I think part of that distinction for me is like so much of for me as a photographer, what I love about it is observing. And I think if I'm a little bit further removed from like the inner workings of theater, which I do so much photography in addition to other subject matters too. But like if I'm not in it, I can observe it more accurately.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's kind of like being a fly on the wall versus like being like the active change agent. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm
totally.
like still working through that one. But yeah, I would say I'm a photographer first and I bring the skills and craft of photography as like that's what I lead with. And then the knowledge of theater and experience of theater as an added bonus. But
Mhm.
photography, number one for me.
So walk me through when you're young and you're holding your point and shoot camera. Are you just like taking pictures because they look nice? What's going through your head? Are you at that age thinking about story, thinking about point of view? What are what's going on?
That's a good question because I like the early 2000s were such like an interesting time for like digital
Mhm.
media. Like I remember like I had my little point and shoots and I was mostly like taking photos of my friends. And
Mhm.
I think it was like the era of like MySpace and like early Facebook. And I remember wanting to take photos of my friends, but I think want it to be like prolific in
Mhm.
that. Like I felt like I was like documenting my own history.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know that it was necessarily like and that side of it was initially creative, but it more so was like, yeah, kind of like everyday documentary photography, which, or in a lot of ways, there's a term called vernacular photography, which is very much like that style of like everyday
Huh.
photography. And then what's interesting is that, like, when you look at those photos, um, outside of the context of being like, I'm going to put this on Facebook, and you look at those as a whole, suddenly it becomes its own artistic collection. But at the time, it's just there to, document every day. So
Right.
I think about that. But then also at the same time, I remember in middle school or when I finished eighth grade and was getting ready to go to high school, we got like a camcorder, my brother and I. And I remember like trying to make like mini movies. And so the creative part was there. I don't think I just consciously connected them. But they were the both sides were present.
Yeah. Um, that's that's wonderful. When you then grow up and you're pursuing the craft more and you're looking more into making this a job and a profession, what are you seeking when you're looking to be a photographer? Are you looking to is it document his being a historian, creative? Is it all of that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of all of it. So, it's funny because I was talking about, like, coming to it as a photographer, or, like, right now in my career and for the last decade plus, um, being, like, very much a photographer, but I actually studied theater. So it's like, once again, the DNA strands.
Sure.
I studied theater. I thought I was gonna be a stage manager, and, I just realized it was really hard for me to be a creative person doing a non-creative thing in a creative space.
That's I couldn't do stage management either. I tried.
I loved it. Like, I'm
Yes.
very organized. I'm very neat. I loved doing it, and I did it for a couple of years out of college while also photographing, separately. But I so long story short, yeah, I studied theater and did theater, but when I was in college, that's when I also like dove into photography in a much uh deeper way. I got my first DSLR, and it was at the time when so many of my friends were getting ready to go to apply to grad school. So they needed things like new headshots. They needed production photos. They needed
Mhm.
portfolio pieces if they were a designer. And I just photographed so much of those. And then my senior year, my college theater department hired me as their staff photographer.
Mm,
So I think so. It's been to answer the question. It's been a little bit of once again, I like it's a both. Like I was trying to be creative while also capturing, what is around me and capturing what's around me artfully. I think that's part of the love of photography for me is it's not generating for the most part. Throughout history, it hasn't been like I'm gonna generate something new from scratch. It's a lot of it has been the art of taking what's in front of you, whether that's a person for a portrait, whether that are certain elements around you to make a creative project, but like they're still real and tangible, or
yeah.
even just documenting and creatively photographing your environment or a certain subject matter. It's this blend of art with the real world that really intrigues me. So I think coming up and like trying to pursue photography, um, especially with that theater side and that notion of like generating and being creative and
Mhm.
expressive. It's been blending that with my love of like trying to find the beauty in the world around me, you know?
Totally. I think that comes through in your work. And I want to talk to you a little about style. And I'm not sure I think every artist and any medium would have their own point of view on how they define if they have a style, if that exists. But when I look at your work, there's so much depth and life in these images, and you adapt to every scenario, whether it's a production shot or it's a portrait or lifestyle or birds in the sky, but it feels like you come at it in your own unique way. Is that something that you're aware of every time you're like literally pointing and shooting, or something that comes together in the end?
Yeah, it's a thing that I'm aware of when I'm photographing. Also, thank you. That's also like I like am so bad at taking a compliment. I'm
No,
trying to get better at it. So I'm trying to say like I'm very grounded. Thank you very much.
you're very welcome.
Yeah, but it is a thing that I think about a lot. I think a core element to my photography is it's gonna sound so like woo woo, but it's empathy.
Yeah.
Like, and I think there are ways to train that sense of empathy. I think for me, yeah, we talked about like the notion of observation, but like I don't want a big part of observing and then translating something from the moment and capturing it into a still image that lives in perpetuity is I want to like if somebody else is looking at that photo who wasn't in that space, in that room, in that, scenario,
Mhm.
I want them to feel like they are there, like they are there present because of me. They're not looking at like a canned, flat image. They're
Mm,
looking at something with a sense of perspective, with a sense of voice and personality, and but not like my own like it's not about like here I am like being the loudest person in the room. Like it's like you're looking at it through thoughtful eyes, and part of that is a big part of the creative practice, whether it is photographing production photos or rehearsal photos or even if it's like a non-theater thing, let's say I use it a lot when I'm doing more journalistic work, is thinking, how does this feel? And so
mhm,
you're trying to constantly be aware of how something feels and filter that through the tools
mhm,
and mechanics or technique of photography. And so you're blending how it feels with things like composition, with framing, with the lighting, with even your perspective of, are you doing is this a close-up? Is this not or a scene photo? Are you capturing character or are you capturing detail?
yeah.
And so in a still image you're getting a sense of empathy, but then when you look at it as a collection, hopefully you have enough variety that tells a full story. I think, yeah, maybe that's the theater part of it. It's like a
Yeah.
lot of that comes, it touches on storytelling. Yeah.
Do you feel pressure when you're in the moment defining how it feels for you and then how you want it to feel? Or is it almost like a handoff where you are taking the moment as it comes, however it comes, and then it's up to the viewer to decide how they feel and what the feeling of the image is after?
Um, I think it's probably more the former.
Mhm.
I'm thinking a lot about, and it's not even about like how am I crafting this image to feel a certain way. It's really understanding like what am I feeling? Like
Right.
being attuned with myself and then trying to figure out how to truthfully document that in an evocative way. Um but also the journalist side of me is like I photograph it how I see it, how I view it, what is happening, but then I present it and somebody else can have a completely different takeaway from it. My job is to craft and to curate, but then not tell somebody how to feel, if that makes any sense. I
It
don't know.
does.
It's like tough because it's like, yeah, it is coming from me. So like I'm obviously putting something in it, but at the same time, I'm a big believer that like when I am making a photo and like that's you know self-reflection, self-expression, that is filtering my own emotions. But then when I publish a photo, it's not for me anymore. Like it's for the
Mhm.
other people. Like I'm inviting people in, and I don't want to like invite them in and then like hover over them and be like, "This is what you feel," you know.
Mhm. Yeah. I that makes perfect sense to me. How much of a role does editing play into this?
So much of a role. I think in both in terms of there are two ways to edit. Um, there's of course editing like an image based on like color and all of that stuff and like kind of the post processing. But also the other part of editing is curating. And I think those are so it's a side of the editing process that doesn't get talked about enough, but I'll talk about both.
Yeah, I'd love it.
I'm a Gemini, if you can't tell, everything is like both. Um, no, so like in terms of the edit, I think a lot about specifically you mentioned depth. Depth is something that's really important to me because depth
Mhm.
is a thing that gives life texture and richness and helps us feel like we're in the image. And that is depth. And once again, in terms of composition, maybe there's something in the foreground, or maybe there's a central point of focus. And then what is that fall off in terms of your point of focus? So I think about that a lot. How can I create a three-dimensional feeling, or if I'm not creating a three-dimensional feeling, that also is just as intentional.
Mhm.
And then I think a lot about depth with in terms of like shadow and shading and texture and different ways to create that. Sometimes like color and contrast helps create depth, all of that stuff. So that part of the edit is really really important to me
Yeah,
because I think I gave myself an artistic mission. It's like when I moved to New York almost 10 years ago, 10 years ago this year. That's kind of crazy. Anyway,
congratulations.
um but I told myself, I can't remember it, but I wrote it in my little like notes app that like I want my it said something like I want my photos to feel creative and artistic, but grounded in a way that says these photos are human. Um, and with that in mind, when I am editing and creating that depth, that kind of is my like guiding light. And but with that, I think of like richness as well.
Mhm.
And conversely, I want to make things feel rich and compelling, like capturing the natural beauty of it if it's in like a natural light scenario or even if it's a studio portrait and I'm trying to capture the heart of something. So I think about that, but then Yeah, but then and then if I'm doing something more artificial, or if I like it's essentially the contrast of that. I want
Right.
things to be rich. So if things are not feeling rich and depth and lush and evocative, and I go the other direction, that also is really intentional.
Yeah.
Um, and then in terms of the other side of editing, the curating, I think a lot about um less is more sometimes. Like I use a lot of restaurant metaphors in my creative practice because I like to cook and bake.
Let's
Um,
hear it.
and I think like if you go to a dinner party, like you want somebody to like guide you through the meal. You don't want like somebody to be like, here's a collection of ingredients and make of it what you will. And I think about that with like when
Mhm.
I'm narrowing down and to make a robust but concise edit that accurately tells a full story.
Yeah,
And with that, less is more
I
for
love
me.
that. I think that's a fascinating way to look at it all, and I really appreciate how you dove in, and I think hearing what you said and then looking at your images side by side, that makes a lot of sense
Thanks.
and is very inspiring, to not only me as an artist, but I think a lot of people that see both sides of the coin of they you see a lot of people with cameras and that are like taking pictures, and then you see the final output, and sometimes it's like, who's the person taking these, and are we giving them enough credit? Are we putting enough emphasis on this? Something I think a lot about is when, like the movie Civil War, which I don't know if you saw.
I
uh
haven't seen it, but I know a little bit about it.
yeah, I'm less interested in right now talking about like the film as a whole, but the way it talks about photographers, and it's kind of just like photographers are everywhere, and like they're kind of always happening and in the moment. And this is also as someone that, I was never photographing at your level, but as someone that was content capturing a lot at Broadway shows, behind the scenes shoots, red carpets and stuff, it can often feel like people don't want you there, at least in my case. And
Yep.
it's like you're such a like I was so in the way, I was invading, but then at the end of the day, it's the visual thing that everyone wants and looks at. And it's such this dichotomy of like, why as a society we like don't want to be intruded on, but then we love being on camera, but we don't want to look bad, but then we want everyone to see.
Yeah, I that is that and that's me like nervously laughing because of like our experience. I think um hmm you like touched on so many things. There's so many like parts of the spider web that I want to go to. The first one is like, yeah, like we live in such a society that is like such a content era. And which is cool. Like we have the accessibility of these tools, whether it is photo or video, or even like anybody can like have a website, anybody can
Mhm.
have a newsletter, anybody can, do all of these things. And I think that is really, really special and beautiful to like democratize the art of making.
Mhm.
But also at the same time, I I personally try to separate for myself the act of making art and making content. And
Mm.
I think that is for me as an artist. And that's like both of those art and content are so valid. But when I'm making photos, I want to make sure I'm making art. And then I have to like put on two different hats, right? Like I'm like, okay, this is the artist photographer side of me. I didn't make stuff. And then when I'm done and I'm like sharing it, I'm putting on the content hat. And I'm like, okay, how can I share this, utilize this, tell stories, and invite people in with it, with this thing that I made, but I made it as art. And I think of that also with client work as well. Um, but then also, yeah, you're talking about that specifically in the theater industry, that kind of that like from a distance, kind of not pushing away, not interested in like being there. There's sometimes people can be prickly about it. And I think with theater in particular, so much of it is such a closed unit, safe space,
Right.
and space is tight backstage. And or also it's a lot of like vulnerability happening backstage, and also ego and all of that stuff. And I think
Mm.
um I try not to take anything personally.
Mm.
Actually, and I'm trying to actually be better at taking things more personally. Um, because I'm like, oh, that's okay, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
no, like if somebody doesn't want me there, that is totally fine by me. But then, or if somebody like has feelings, like we're all humans, and if somebody's like, oh, like they don't want me backstage, or if they're giving me like a really tight box to play within, I think like that's not about me. That's about like them and where they are. So I don't take things personally. But then I'm also trying to these days take things more personally in the sense of like trying not to be as amenable. Like I want to, of course, be amenable and collaborative, but I also don't want to deprioritize myself in
Yep.
those spaces. I want to make sure, like, yeah, I was here for a reason. I'm here to make art, and we can get through this together. But um, yeah, and I think the last thing I'll say on that is like a thing that the Broadway community, in particular, more than any other industry that I've worked in, Broadway and theater, Broadway specifically, I feel like Broadway can't figure out if they view photographers as vendors or collaborators. And
Mm.
I personally am in a spot that's like, great, I'll answer that question for you. I'm a collaborator.
Yeah.
And very much in the same way that like if you're a collaborator, designing a show and you take up space and you have needs and you ask for what you need,
Hmm.
as a collaborator, I'm going to do the same. And as a collaborator, I'm bringing myself to the art that I'm making, and not just the art that I'm making, but like this process of making theater as a whole. So I'm bringing myself and my perspective to that, and that deserves to have a space on the stage, no pun intended, as well as everybody else's, versus being completely deferential to the client. I want, like, I'm giving you my artwork. I want to make sure that you're seeing it as my artwork. And that sounds like, obviously we're talking about like some of the prickly stuff of like theater and all of that stuff, but that's also like there's also so much joy and love and craft and
Right.
collaboration that I get out of it as well. I think I'm just speaking to like where I am, especially at the beginning of the year, moving forward. I just rambled for a long time. I hope they
No, that
make
was
sense.
beautiful. And I've never heard someone specifically in the Broadway space, but I think this is true to many industries. Um, Explain it down so simply and accurately to vendor and collaborator. I think that is so true. And there's so many different roads I want to go on. And yes, to you are correct. We are talking about like the prickly stuff, and there is so much love and joy, and we are going to get into that. I think what I was happy we got towards was this idea of vendor v collaborator, and how you have just spent the beginning of this show talking about who you are as an artist and what makes your art your art. So then it's time to shoot and submit. You then are creating art versus content, like you shared, and then it's, are you a vendor versus collaborator? The an example I can think off the top of my head that some listeners may know, and not to obviously compare you, but I would put you in good company with like Matt Murphy, whose joke is more haze or more
Mhm.
fog. Whenever he goes to do a production shoot, because he wants the lights and he wants the images to look a certain way, he often will shout or ask for more haze, more fog. And I think that that is what separates a vendor and a collaborator. He's not just there to like take pictures for you to like post. He's there
Mhm.
to sculpt something with you. And that's what you're getting at, which is when you are backstage and people don't understand what it's like to be backstage. And the unions, with respect, love them. With the cast, respect, love them. It is. there's no space for you. And I've heard stories, I don't know if it was you, of photographers having to stand in a laundry basket. Um, was
That
that
wasn't
you?
me, but that's amazing.
Okay. So it's like to get in the space and you are capturing something that is so vital to the health of the show in terms of it as a business, in terms of it as content and an output. But then in the moment, there are so many things going at so many miles an hour. Like you said, it is a deeply personal and safe space. So often of the time, um, I'm so happy that we kind of came to this where we're kind of getting to dissect this, because most of the time you get beautiful work out of it. You get really wonderful work out of it. And everyone's happy. But there is a human side to it that you also have to acknowledge and then grow and embrace.
Mhm, mhm. I feel like that's one you compared me to Matt Murphy, and that is, like, the highest honor. I love Matt so much. He's the best man and also so talented,
Mhm,
and I would just remember, like, when he came onto the scene, um, like, watching the way that just through his creative practice, he, like, shifted the industry,
mhm,
and he's so intentional about his work, and I think that is a thing that, yeah, I'm really intentional about my work, but then if somebody else has, like, an opinion or they're like, "Can you do this instead?" Like, I am like, "Okay, sure." And instead of being like, "What is my intention?" Like, that's the part about, like, my goal of prioritizing myself and my own artistry, and that is for myself, the vendor versus collaborator part. Sometimes I become, like, so vendor oriented that I like take myself out of it and I'm trying to like flip the scales or not flip the scales for sure. I think this year, let's say if I'm usually 60% vendor, 40% collaborator. This year, I want to be 60% collaborator and 40%.
mhm.
And probably on those scales always change. I don't know. I'm not good at math. But in any case, so there's that. But then also, you were talking about, yeah, being backstage and like, you said there's no space for you sometimes. And that's like both metaphoric and also like so literal in these like 100-year-old buildings that have these tiny hallways that then also like backstage space is tight. And so like being like, yeah, sometimes they're like stand in this tiny little corner because a thing is about to fly down from the sky and we don't want you to get hurt. Um, but then also, yeah, like there are all of these union rules and all of that stuff. One of my big projects for this year is like, and this is the journalist coming out in me, is I want to find out when those rules were made and why and
Mm,
all of that stuff. But I think with that and some of the pushback that we get when you're making stuff backstage and things can be prickly, is I think people get so caught up in the moment and you talked about like yeah there are humans making this, and so I am just trying, this is part of like once again like the craft of empathy, quote unquote, which is like I do simple things like I make sure that I am like talking to everybody and asking
mhm.
them their name and like trying to talk to them as people so they see me as a person and not just as a floating camera.
Yeah.
um, and like I recently did a shoot at Hell's Kitchen and I like it was a two-show day. I was backstage photographing all of it. And the
Wow.
crew, very protective, very like they're like crew members, you know? They're like,
Mhm.
"Oh god, the artist boy is here again. We have a show to run." And then and which like go off. I get it. I'm sure they see so many people who are like doing wild shit like and while they're like trying to be creative and they're like, "Here's a flying set piece." Um but I still was like, it's important for them to see, it's important for me, for them to see me as a person. And so in between shows, I went to Schmackery's and got cookies and I
Well,
totally bribed them. They didn't know it was a bribe. I wrote like on the little note in between when I delivered them, I was like, thanks for keeping me safe. Like, but it was really a bribe. And then afterward, they were so much nicer to me. And so
yeah,
like, how can I show that I'm a human? And because like so much of, maybe this is the photographer in me, um, so much of our work, I can't control what other people are doing. I can only control where I am and what I
yeah.
do. And so with that, I can't be like, hey, treat me like a person, be nice to me. Instead, I can just show up and be nice to them. And then energy is just kind of like, they're like, oh yeah, he is a person. He is kind of cool and is not gonna be running around backstage unsafely.
Right. It's this, you're there to create work that will help the show and ensure that these people have jobs moving
Yeah,
on. But that's not what anyone's thinking about in the
yeah,
moment. So, and oftentimes even me, and like I were, and I want to talk to you about if you get nerves or if you like how you overcome that, because to this day, one of the hardest parts of what I did for the past 5 6 years was the content captures with celebrities or with artists of a higher profile that you like could just feel didn't really want to be doing something, but then you're like, but then I would be like, I was like, just like you said, all I control is how I am. So like it's after the show, they're meeting the cast and stuff, and then I have to get a video of them doing a dance from the show. And it's like, who wants to be the one to ask them to do that and then do it? And I just go and I go, hey, it's like, thank you so much for coming. I was like, it's so great to see you. We're so happy you're here. I work in social. Can you do this? And like, that's the way that I would build the bridge to both make them and myself feel comfortable in these spaces. When you're doing the 2 show day, you obviously have gotten to a point where you have the beauty and empathy inside of you to recognize, to go get the cookies, to go like create this bridge. But what is going through your mind at the day, because you're putting yourself in this foreign situation, you're taking photos for an artistic purpose, and then you're also there to work.
ooh, that's such a good question. I think what is going through my mind is I put a lot of pressure on myself as an artist. And so part of that is trying to like get rid of a lot of the pressure to be like, I must make the next great American photograph through this. I think like that amount of pressure, like obviously I want to work hard, but that amount of pressure is just not sustainable and not realistic.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to like do that while also thinking so creatively in my brain and keeping track of like the tools in my toolbox mentally and creatively, making sure I'm making choices
Hmm.
versus just like letting the wind take me where it wants to. I want to make sure that I'm always like I'm locked in as a photographer.
Hmm.
Um and so I mean a big part of my creative practice too is writing. Like it's part of the empathy. Like I have an artist notebook. It's actually sitting right next to me.
Oh,
And part of that is like I write like what's inspiring me, what am I looking to do. I write like a little goal for every single project that I do.
mm,
um I look at references beforehand, and like as any artist, like we just have this catalog of things that inspire us and influence us, whether that is within our field or also outside of it. Um, and like where I get inspiration from outside of photography and other mediums. And so I'm like keeping my track of those. But the biggest thing is I want to make sure that I'm making choices. So there's that. And then also just like so that is what's going on in my creative brain, and the other side is like my being like uh when my brain is working too hard, I realize I start talking fast, and so I'm like, can people understand me? Am I being clear? am I being nice? What's happening?
Yeah.
So I think about that, but in terms of, like, the other part of, like, being, like, starstruck or getting nervous, that part, I don't get nervous when working with, like, talent anymore. Um, I think for a couple of reasons. One is, like, we are in, like, sometimes when we're backstage, we're, like, in a midtown basement that is 100 years old and, like, so dusty, like,
Yeah.
where is the glamour? Because it's not here.
It's not standing next to a dumpster at the stage door,
Exactly.
getting a picture of a celebrity. Yeah, it's like it's never like "Oh my gosh, you're so famous, I don't want" it's like, I just don't want anyone to be mad at me, but that's a personal
Oh,
thing.
yeah, but then that's the other part that, like, is, like, where I, like, when it comes to work, like, don't take things personally.
Mhm,
Um, I'm like, I'll ask, and people are allowed to be mad at me if they don't wanna do it. Like, they just got done doing a show. They could be tired, and that is A-okay. I
mhm.
still have to ask because it's my job. And I think part of that also comes from working at Playbill. I was there for 5 years, and from 2017 to the beginning of 2022. And, um I just photographed I photographed so many people,
Yeah,
and especially, like, when you're going to a press day or you're at an opening night, people just wanna go into their thing. They don't wanna have their photo taken, but I'm here to ask, and they're allowed to say no, but I have to ask for the photo. I have to, like, take up space, and just, like, yeah, the amount of stuff that I like, it's similarly, it's just not sustainable to be nervous that
yeah.
much, and, um, and I'm an introvert, so it's really funny that I'm like, "Oh, yeah, they can be mad at me," but, like, I don't know, it's part of the agreement that we all have made.
Yeah.
Like, if you wanna go to this thing and you know there's a red carpet, I get it. I don't wanna be at this red carpet. Red carpets are actually my least favorite thing to
Mine
photograph.
too.
There yeah. Yeah, it's like I especially as, like, a person who A, is creative and also B, um, is, like, so empathetic. I always say, like, red carpets are, like, the suggestion of human connection. You get, like, 20 seconds with a person who looks at you, they get their photo, and they go to the next person. More than that more than, like I don't like photographing, like, red carpets, like, where I'm there to capture, like, fashion. I would rather tell the story
Yeah.
of photographing an opening or photographing a red carpet. It's funny, when I was at the GYPSY opening, I wasn't working, but I
Mhm.
always have my camera with me, so I just took photos of, like, my experience, like, and part of that was, like, "Here's a thing that's happening on the red carpet, and this is what" like, and those to me are so much more interesting than, like, just getting, like, solo photos for which is important as well, but, like, I
Right.
just it's not I want more story, but yeah, so I get what you're talking
It
about, the red carpet. They just people just wanna go to their after party and, like, drink and have fun and celebrate, and here I am being like, "Okay, one more this way. Can you, like, hands in your pocket?" Like, all of
yeah,
that.
I wish I had had the nerves to do this when I was working, but I was working, which was the problem, but another thing a lot of fans may not realize is those carpets are hours. They are hours and hours and hours in the freezing cold, um, in the heat. You sometimes have to do it twice before the show, then after. Post-COVID, a great thing that shows started doing is they had the cast walk early, so then at least but then the cast don't like it because they have to get glammed twice,
Mhm.
but then you at least don't have to do 2 red carpet like, it's like, it is nuts. They are the size of like a small U-Haul, the carpets themselves,
Yeah, they're
and
tiny.
it's just a lot of, pressure and stress on everyone, and I think that that also then comes in, like, the vendor collaborator moment where it's like, "Yeah, I'm just here to, like, we know what we need to do, and, like, we're just" w
Right, but then also this is part of, like, the vendor collaborator, vendor artist part. Sometimes I'm like, I'm here to do what I need to do." And, like, which is understandable, especially when you're covering, like, so many day in and day out. But then I look at there's this thing that I do, which is like I will look at photos that I took when I'm hired for a show
Mhm.
at like a red carpet, or I did. I actually last year said no more red carpet, so I turned down those gigs, and I also just I sent a wide email to my theater contacts and just said I don't do red carpets anymore. This is what I do, like, and that's part of like taking up more space
Good for you.
as a photographer, but if I am at a thing, I will look at like what is approved and what is allowed from the show. And then also when like the New York Times or another outlet's there and like the level of creativity that they're able to do because they're not that
Th
photographer isn't there and they're not like the repetition of it isn't like one they have a different eye and a different aim, but also like what's the like there's a thing that I'm trying to get at. Essentially, like when you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, you kind of go on autopilot
Mhm,
and you're going on autopilot well, but
mhm.
like your brain is like, okay, I'm checking off the list versus other things. But then the other side of that too is like approvals and what gets approved.
Yes.
And when you are working for an outlet, they're not their approvals aren't being filtered through a million people who are there to represent and sell a show. They're there to report on the show, so they get to have a lot more creativity. And so I try to remind myself for projects, think more on that side rather than the other like I was hired by your show side. But approvals,
That so
photo approval are the worst two words in the English language.
I agree. And that's what I actually wanted to literally talk about next when you're working with outlets or clients and you're dealing with approvals because I think, for Broadway production photos specifically, those for you to see one image, for the fans, for the public to see one image of literally anything, it has been weeks and versions and edits and craziness and reshoots. And then whereas like the New York Times, they I believe just get to post whatever they want.
Yeah.
Um, so talk to me about when you're there, you're also balancing two things. You're then like, I want to capture this as I want to capture it, but then I also want to capture this in a way that will be both be approved and what they literally want.
Yeah, yeah, it's a tough balance, and at a certain point, you have to just be prepared to kill your darlings,
Mm.
um, because I'm also like that's the other side of like I am here to photograph. Mm, I was gonna say I am there to photograph the show for the clients, like I am like that is I'm there as a vendor and that's being used. Those photos are going to be used for press, they're going to be used for the front of house, they're going to be used for all of these other things. But then the other part of me is I think a lot about that Instagram account Bygone Broadway,
Oh, yes.
and I think to myself I want to make the photos that will be showing up on this in 20 years, and part of that's like that what pushes me to be creative because also sometimes I just want to show off. I just want to be like, here's a cool show and here's a cool way of viewing it. And this is a cool perspective that brings this feeling of the show to people who aren't in the room, who are experiencing that show in a still photo that will live on, for years and years and years to come. And so I try to balance both. It is really difficult, but then also when I'm delivering photos as well, I try to make sure I'm only delivering photos and curating photos that are, once again, I want to have to go broad and capture the full show, but I have to make sure like I'm locked in as a photographer that I'm photographing and delivering those and making those images creatively so that I'm proud of everything that I'm delivering.
Yeah.
Like and sometimes it's hard, right? Like sometimes I mean, a show is 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Like, every photo is not going to be like your favorite, but I want to aim to make every photo my favorite. Like, that's always the bar, and I'm trying to meet
Mm.
that bar. Um, but yeah, but then you go through all of the approvals, and then they're thinking like producers are thinking things of what they need. Talent is thinking of how they want to represent themselves. The press is thinking of like what will get them traction and pickup and all of that stuff. Um, and it's hard. And I will say like almost I'm thinking like of the shows that I've photographed, and nearly every show the collection of images that publish are not my favorite.
Mhm.
I'm like because and yeah, just because like the people making decisions have a different perspective than me, the artist. And so that's part of also like why I'm trying to like take up more space and communicate more as a human and as a collaborator. And like
Mhm.
I've started doing this thing where when I deliver photos, I deliver all of them, and then I have a subfolder where I'm like, and these are my favorites of that full collection, so
Yeah.
they can see at least. I'm like, I'm just trying to bring more of myself to it. But and sometimes, like I said, you have to kill your darlings and just let them go.
Yeah, 2 things that you touched on. One, it's important to understand all of this, that all of this is a part of the role, is a part of being an artist. I think that that is, like, such a fundamental understanding, and it is something that I don't know if you can be taught immediate like, in an hour in a class, but you learn over years, but it's like you have to be able to have that fundamental understanding of, like, how things and how people work, but then also not to discount you still the photos that publish are still your photos,
Yeah,
and that is the direct result, the beautiful result of you understanding the game and your art to kind of then deliver what is published.
yeah, and I think that's what's interesting is like, yeah, it's like the content part of it. I'm in this like professional space where it like emotionally and mentally, which is we live in such a content world, like we said, and because of that, there are so many people who are making content, and if my artwork is gonna go out as content with my name on it, I wanna make sure that, like, it stands out and doesn't like, you are seeing me for my voice, because I don't wanna be like, "Oh, yeah, I'm just a person with a camera," like, taking a photo the same as everybody else, since everybody has cameras these days, whether it's on their
Mhm.
phone or whatever. I wanna make sure that, like, my name is my name is attached to artwork that is representative of me, um,
Yeah.
and I haven't done it much, but occasionally, I like, if there's a project that, like, I'm like, "Oh, you put me in such a bad scenario," um, and, this is not a good project, I will just say like, "Great, and you don't have to put my credit on this. Can you just say courtesy of," and then the institution or the outlet or the whatever? But
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't want that's not you're taking me out of my element. You're making me do a thing that I can't artistically stand by, but for
Mhm.
you. Um, and I push back, and you're still making me do it. So then, in that case, they're not my photos; they're yours. I'm the hired hand, the sword
Uh,
for hire. But my name's not going to go on that. I haven't had to use that very often. I think in my career, I've done it maybe like 2 or 3 times, and I've been doing this professionally since 2011, 2012.
yeah.
2011 was when I had that staff photographer job in college. So I've, like, been doing it for a long time,
Yeah.
so, like, only 2 or 3 times out of those, all of those years is not a bad batting average, so
No, and it also shows so much maturity on your end, to have the confidence in yourself to know that if you really needed to, that's an option that you could go down. Thank you for sharing.
of course.
Do you have a concept in mind, whether it would be for Broadway, it could be journalism, it could be anything where you're like, if someone gave me, my rate, what they needed, this is what I want to do, whether that's like a specific way of like taking production photography or a specific way of working with a client for like a journalism project.
Yeah, ooh, that's a good question. And, like, immediately, like, so many things pop to my brain. Um, One thing that I really, really, really want to photograph is I want to embed with a tech team from load-in all the way to opening night or first preview. So I
Mm,
like we especially with unions, we don't get to see the actual craft of making it. I want to see somebody putting together a flat that will then fly up into the sky.
mhm.
Like I want to see what it's like making like because like a lot of like for instance like costume spaces, hair rooms, dressing like they're all just a blank canvas, and then you have to build everything. And I want to see what is it like to build that. What is it like to turn a blank four wall space into your hair department? What is it like hanging and focusing those lights and then seeing those lights become this incredible special that happens during a show?
Mhm.
Um, so many of those like that is my one of my many dream projects. There are so many challenges with that to
Yeah.
make that happen. Unions, rate, access. I just love long form storytelling, and I want to see
Mm,
more long form storytelling that is not filtered for the sake of selling something, but filtered for the sake of storytelling. Um, uh, in the space that we're in, like the act of making a Broadway show is so um everything like every to for all of these things to come together is this like act of alchemy that is so special, and I want to invite people in because it was those types of like photos and videos and seeing it that made me believe that I could do it and really inspired me creatively. But I'm also, can I flip that question back to you because like you work so much, like you worked in content creation, you are a graphic designer and do, video content, photo content, um, and also at the same time, weren't you also a director as well?
yeah.
And so,
I
like, having all of these sides, and I think especially your experience working in an agency, you know the act of like being creative and also being a client. And
Mhm.
how do you balance that? How are there things that if you could, you know, take off the rules, the framework, the guidelines, what would you want to make like no holds barred?
Thank you for asking. I have to think about a way to phrase it. I think there's the formula, and I'm really complacent in helping develop some of the formula, and there are a lot of problems where it's like time, resources, access. Something that I've repeated almost every week in meetings when I'm like pitching things to clients is like, I know you, like, to us this is boring, but like to the person sitting in Oklahoma, like this is the coolest thing in the world.
Mhm.
So I think access as a whole, and then the way that we're showing access, um is what's like I'm keenest on. And I think that we all take for granted the, free promo to Broadway.com, but like Broadway.com vlogs. Like I think, I can't speak for you, but like I wouldn't be here if I didn't grow up on those. Like those
Mhm.
had such a foundational impact and knowledge for me. And that is the kind of content. They disappeared for like 10 years. They're just coming back now, which is
Oh,
ironic
you're
that we're having this
right.
conversation. But like they disappeared for 10 years. And then that content was not the content Broadway shows were putting out, because it's like, oh, people don't want to go backstage, or like they don't want to see this. And then like even like the hair and the costume departments, they don't give themselves enough credit sometimes with like, when I'm doing backstage tours, they're like, oh, like we just like put on the, I'm like, no, I'm like, look at all these wigs, look, like how did they get here? So what I'm most interested in is creating um a system that is bigger than the show itself, because then you're
Mhm.
also fighting like, what are we doing that's selling tickets,
Yeah.
which is like the worst thing ever. Because it's like, if you want me to, every week I had to show like the Instagram stats and be like, and these sold tickets because, but it's
Mm.
like you're creating a digital extension of the brand. And
Yeah.
I think that that goes so much deeper than just the images we put out that people are used to, than just like the first rehearsal video, the opening night red carpet sizzle cut.
Mhm.
Like,
I think a lot about what you're talking about, A, with, like, access, like and you said, like, sometimes it might be boring to sit and plot out in a meeting, like, we wanna make this, this, and that, and what are, like, the logistics to make that happen? But then, like, to somebody else, outside of the industry who wants to be in it,
mhm,
when they see it's the coolest thing. When you were talking about that, it r it reminded me of this philosophy that I have that I want not just theater, but, like, so many industries to do. There's so much active selling,
mhm,
but also because we live in a content economy and because we're always scrolling on our phones, I'm like, people don't want to be directly sold to. Instead, what if we just make things that are cool that pulls people in rather than actively running to them and grabbing them? You know what I mean?
right.
If I see a really cool production photo, I'm gonna be like, oh, what is that? And
Yep.
then want to learn more. And then, or if I see like what you were saying, like backstage tours or interviews or with a cast member or designer that gives me that level of access, then
Mhm.
I suddenly start developing a parasocial relationship to that. And I feel like this is a thing that is mine. I'm not sure if you remember this. Do you remember the title of Show?
Yes.
I that I loved that. That show was when I was in senior year of high school, freshman year of college. It was like
Yeah.
that was when the run was, and I felt such a kinship to that cast
Mhm.
because of that show. And it was like in the early heyday of
Yep.
like social media marketing and it wasn't even social media marketing. It was just like digital publishing on
Yes.
an everyday place, and they were being so creative and fun, and at no point were they like, "Get a ticket." They were just, like, being themselves and being goofy, and I trekked from Maryland to go see that show because I was like, "I need to." Like, I feel like I'm connected
Mhm.
to that, and, how can we have a little bit more of that energy? And I think part of that is confidence, right? Like, when you're making theater or you're making anything, you're putting so much investment in that, and how can you and so it's, like, scary to sometimes passively market rather than actively sell, um, and so I get it, but also, like, actively selling, like, sometimes we take the least creative, least interesting
Yep.
choice, and I wanna make more of that. I don't know,
I
that's yeah.
I do too, and I think you also then have to work it into the budget, and
Yeah.
you have to make it a commitment. One of the things that I said all the time is, people wanna talk about social media the least, but then when it's 1 a.m. and they're laying in bed scrolling on their phone, that's when I would get the most emails from, people in charge of like, "Look at what this show is doing, let's do this," or "Why haven't we done this?" or like, "I have a thought about this." I'm like, "Okay, so we agree that everyone this is all very important."
Mhm.
Like this is all very important, and that's why I think the digital expansion of the brand
Mhm.
is so much bigger. This is a bad example. It's a good example for how it literally worked, but a bad example because it wasn't a direct result of marketing, which is like I think Beetlejuice ended up being a success. I had no role to play in Beetlejuice because it got negative reviews.
Did it?
Yes, it got negative reviews at first, was not selling very well, but then it created this whole community because of the casts and the world that it was building outside. And yes, their marketing did play a part in that, but specifically the cast was very online and very dedicated to expanding and growing, and that was something that, as far as I am aware, they did for free.
Mm.
I have worked with social captains on shows in the past where we do pay them a stipend every week to produce content and work with us, and they are like a direct collaborator with me and the show and the producer. But I believe, like in the instance of Beetlejuice, where it's like they're doing these TikTok lives and dances and trends, that is what grows the brand to the
Mhm.
point where it then becomes such a sensation that it closes and comes back, which otherwise would not have happened with the direction
Yeah.
that it was going. And I think that every show kind of like wants that. I think
Mhm.
every producer is like, I would love my show to have the Beetlejuice, the Heathers, the all of these, the Be More Chill. Even though I know when that did come to Broadway, that ended up not working out. But like, they want to have this whole second life of
Yeah.
the show, and you either then have to cast people that will do that for free, or set up a system that propels it to happen.
Yeah.
And we're just not there yet.
And I think when you said, like, set up the system too, the thing that I think about a lot is, like, it's both setting up the system, but then also clearing the hurdles. Like,
Hmm.
if you're hiring somebody to be creative, how can you give them the space to be creative? Um, Instead of, like, putting all of these, like, boundaries on it.
Yeah.
And but also at the same time, I understand that, like, those boundaries exist for a reason, once again, whether they are union rules, whether it is because of budget. But, like, how can we how can we be mindful of those boundaries and work around them? And yeah, and I think about that as an artist, like, on a project by project basis for figuring out, like, yeah, um, sometimes, like, once again, where I am and trying to prioritize myself now, it's like, okay, I see the boundaries. How can I just, like, toe the line a little bit to get what I want, like, to
Mm.
get what I think is cool? Um, yeah. So we'll see.
That's
That
that
was,
is
such a chaotic face that I just made.
no, but it's beautiful because I think it's so representative of your journey and where you are, and I'm so proud of you to be able to sit, and take that stance, and have the confidence in yourself to know that that's the direction that you're in and the place that you deserve.
Mhm.
This has been the most beautiful conversation, and I'm so proud that we got to the places we got to. And I think it's really important, not even just for us as peers, and if no one ever listens, I'm so glad that this I learned a lot from this, and I'm very thankful. I really appreciate you joining me. Where can the people find you?
First off, thank you. This was also a similarly, like, I what a great conversation, what a great way to start the day. And I'm also so proud of you. Like, anytime anybody takes a creative swing and makes something from scratch, as they say, "Look, you made a hat where there never was a hat."
Yeah,
And, like, that's I'm just the act of making is so beautiful, and the fact that you're making this space is really cool.
thank
And
you.
also we got to talk about, like, the nerdy photographic artistic shit. I never get
Hmm.
to talk about that, so that's really
I'm
fun.
so glad we
Um,
did.
where can people find me? I'm at Marc J. Franklin on Instagram. That's mostly where I am. I had a Twitter and then it all
Mm.
kind of went downhill. So I technically still have one, but I don't use it.
Yeah.
So I would say Instagram at Marc J. Franklin or at my website, which is marcjfranklin.com. Mark is with a C, by the way. So
I see.
MARC J
All right.